Well, life groups, as we continue in chapter 5, we see very clearly this pattern of rejecting darkness and walking in the light, and building up in verse 15. He says, "Look carefully then as you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best of use of time, because the days are evil." And so the whole point in this section, as he's wrapping up chapter 5, is to say that there is a way to live, there is a way to act that is foolish, and there is a way to live, and there is a way to act that is wise. And sometimes, and we need to make this distinction, because sometimes there are things that we say that are not sinful, but they are foolish. It might not be sinful for us to spend hours and hours looking at our screens, but it is very foolish if we are not using the time that God has given us wisely. That's kind of the whole point of verse 16, right? Making the best use of time because the days are evil. There are certain things that we can do and be distracted by, and it's not necessarily that they're sinful things, but they are foolish things. They are not things that lead to the building up of the kingdom. They're not things that lead to the encouragement of others. They're not things that lead for the benefit of our family or ourselves or our friends or the church. They are things that diminish the quality of those relationships, the quality of those other activities that are considered wise and that lead to human flourishing. And he continues in verse 22 and gives perfect examples about how we are to walk as wise. He says, to the wives, he says, submit yourselves to your own husband. To the husband, he said, love your wives as Christ loved the church. And so he starts with the most intimate of relationships, and he says, here's how you conduct yourself as wise people, not as foolish people, because there's a way to conduct yourself as foolish people, and ultimately that leads to sin and that leads to death. But there's a way to conduct yourself as wise people, and that leads to life, and that leads to the flourishing of this relationship between a husband and a wife. And I encourage you in your groups to dive into that, especially if you're a group that has a lot of couples. Dive into those texts deeply. But then he continues and he expands on that in chapter 6, beginning chapter 6, he goes, children now, right? So he's got the husband and the wife, and now he's going, children, obey your parents in the Lord, right? So this is, if you're a child, right, what does a wise child look like? We obey our parents. We honor our parents. And then he goes even more outside of that family dynamic. He goes into bondservants, right, into employees and employers, and at this time, right, slaves and slave masters, right? But he's building up and he's saying, here's how you are to conduct yourself in all these various relationships. And the whole point is saying, don't live as foolish people, live as wise people. There's a way to act. There's a way to connect. There's a way to encourage that leads for the good of others and for the good of yourself and for the glory of God. And there's a way to act that is foolish, that leads to sin, and that ultimately leads to death. And so just for today's lesson, I encourage you to look into these relationships that he discusses in this section. Look in it deeply and consider, what does it look like to be a wise wife? What does it look like to be a wise husband? What does it look like to be a wise child? And I mean, right, children, obey your parents. That's not given, like that's not up until 18, right? So how do we, or like honor your father and mother, that's not up until you're 18. There's no caveat for that, right? So how do we do that even in our grown relationships? And then how do we deal with friends in a wise way? How do we deal with co-workers and bosses in a wise way? The Bible has much to say about that, and so I encourage you to continue to look into those things. Blessings.